we're going to get started. So welcome to all of you to the Centre for Catholic Formation, and welcome to our viewers online as well. So first thing, just to give a couple of sort of fire safety announcements. We're not expecting a drill this evening, but if the alarm should go off, the place to gather is out on the lawn in front. The loos are on the stairs, and I think that's enough of that. So, welcome to this second in the series of 4 talks that we're hosting here, celebrating the newest saint of the Church in these Isles. In 1991, Newman was proclaimed venerable by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, the first stage in the canonization process. He was beatified on 19th of September 2010 at an open-air mass celebrated by Pope Benedict XVI in Birmingham, which I was there getting increasingly wet with all my little children on the day. I remember it very well, during the first papal state visit to the UK. And just recently, in November 2018, the Vatican approved a second miracle involving the unexplained healing of a pregnant American woman from a life-threatening diagnosis. This was investigated by the Archdiocese of Chicago. And on the 13th of February 2019, it was announced that Pope Francis had approved the decree concerning this miracle. And Newman's canonization is expected to take place in Rome later this year. So in honour of Newman, we'll be exploring the legacy of England's most famous convert and his ongoing importance in living, teaching and passing on the faith, which is something that's very related and very important to us, obviously, here at the Centre for Catholic Formation. Tonight, the second in this series of 4 talks will be on the development of doctrine, one of the most important and oft quoted, but perhaps least kind of understood of Newman's kind of important concepts. And so it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Deacon Stephen Morgan is a deacon of the Portsmouth Diocese. He obtained his doctorate on Newman's Theology at St Benet's Hall in Oxford, and is currently the Dean of Religious Studies at the University of St Joseph in Macau in China, preparing people, priests, religious and lay people for the great mission in China and beyond as well. So we're very pleased that he made the journey here all the way just for us this evening, and I'll ask you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Morgan.
Pier Paolo, thank you very much. A few preliminary remarks. You'll see me take glasses off and change glasses. Those of you who are, like me, older than once we were, will know that eyesight's a problematic thing. I've tried using varifocals. They just make me fall over and feel sick. So I will change glasses quite a lot. This has a great convenience. It means that I can't see the look on your face when I'm reading my speech. So I have no idea whether you like what I'm saying or not. And it also means if you ask me a difficult question, I buy myself plenty of time by taking these off. My children would also tell you that if I talk for any period of time with my glasses off, it means I'm going to say something unpleasant to you. It's cowardice. The second thing to say was I very much enjoyed your fire safety briefing. I heard a fire safety briefing at a conference in a place called Yun in China recently by somebody who had obviously spent too much time on aeroplanes, because halfway through this fire safety briefing they began by getting to, and in the event of a landing on water, which seemed fairly unlikely this conference was going to land on water, and I can't see this catechetical centre doing that either. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I did have other causes to be in Britain at the moment, so I haven't come just for this. But I have come from a place that we're all accustomed to calling the Far East. And although this has got nothing to do with the subject of the development of doctrine, it's worth noting that the Oxford English Dictionary says that the expression Far East to describe the Orient was first coined in 1852 in a sermon preached at the Second Synod of Westminster in St Mary's College, Oscott, by John Henry Newman. So that's the first use of the expression Far East. Maybe it's appropriate that I ended up out there. Maybe it's just convenient, at least to my friends and family, that I'm 6,000 miles away most of the time. To the subject matter. I'm deliberately going to shy away from considering current events in the life of the church. I'm not going to give you an answer in my prepared remarks to questions that you might ask about development of doctrine, specific developments of doctrine or purported developments of doctrine in the recent past. We might come to that in the time of questions, but it's simply too difficult to do that until you've laid out how Newman believes that development works and how we can apply Newman's theology in general terms. So if we want to come to talk about specific changes in the church's teaching and practice, at least in the short term, let's say the last 50 to 60 years, we'll do that in questions. And you'll understand why I've said 50 to 60 years, perhaps later, because I think the elapse of time is an important way by which the church determines whether a development of doctrine is authentic or corrupt. And that's to introduce language that we'll see when we delve into Newman's work on this a little bit more. They're very, very important terms, the authentic development of doctrine and corruption. So how far is too far? What's the status of the question? Writing in the magazine America immediately before the beginning of the fourth period of the Second Vatican Council in January 1965, the American Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray referred to the issue of the development of doctrine as the issue underlying all others at the Council. Murray was writing in response to a decision made by the Secretary General of the Council, Eugene Cardinal Tisserand, to defer the Council's vote on the Schema on Religious Liberty. And his decision was confirmed by Pope Paul VI on the last working day of the third period of the Council. Murray, together with another Peritus at the Council, Pietro Pavan, a professor of social economics at the Pontifical Athenaeum of the Lateran, had drafted this document, and Murray was clearly pretty cross that it was pulled at the last moment. The draft went substantially further than existing Catholic doctrine on religious liberty, and in the America article, Murray was setting out his case for the particular development of doctrine that he was proposing. The manifestation of disquiet which attended Paul VI's confirmation of the decision to defer the consideration of the schema was a foretaste of the lasting theological controversy that was to surround the eventually approved Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. The post-conciliar official theology concerning this doctrine was to be among the root causes of the 1988 schism with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and his followers, and the debate regarding the limits of this doctrine of religious liberty and the extent of the development it entailed continues to today. How the conciliar text that was eventually approved has been interpreted, and whether that interpretation can legitimately be understood as a significant development of doctrine, is an issue outside the terms of the paper, but is perhaps one of the questions we might come back to later. The Second Vatican Council was to see other purported developments, to use Newman's own words, a demonstrable increase and expansion in Christian creed and ritual, of varying degrees of controversy, and the post-conciliar period has been one in which the apparent rate of change has, if anything, accelerated. The question of the extent to which the conciliar changes can be reconciled with previous Catholic doctrine and the post-conciliar changes can be justified by an appeal to conciliar authority has become an acute one. Speaking to the members of the Roman Curia in December 2005, then Pope Benedict XVI made the issue central to an analysis of the appropriate theological approach that should be adopted in considering the Council itself, its teachings and post-conciliar developments. His proposed expression, which many of us are fairly familiar with, the hermeneutic of reform in continuity, with the one subject church was offered as a third way, a tertium quid, differing from the two radically opposed expressions of the same tendency to what the Pope had termed a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. On the one hand, one expression of this rupture has been used to deny the legitimacies of the teachings of the Council, of the post-conciliar magisterium, and, at its most extreme, the institutional identity of the post-conciliar church with the pre-conciliar church. On the other hand, this same claim of rupture, that the Council marked a decisive break with the immediate foregoing period, has been used, so Pope Benedict suggested, on the basis, so it's claimed, of a fidelity to a spirit of Vatican II, to justify radically novel interpretations of the teachings of the Council, and even going well beyond teachings found in the conciliar teachings at all. And all of this before considering the manifesto given to the Council by Pope John the 23rd and confirmed both and during and at the end of the Council by Pope Paul VI, that the Council was to be a pastoral council and not a doctrinal council. In response to all this, Pope Benedict didn't propose a via media, to use a Newman expression, a middle way. He didn't argue for a position that sat halfway between one kind of rupture and another. He proposed an entirely distinct approach, one that took seriously both the fixed and definitive nature of Christian revelation, and also took equally seriously the historically demonstrable fact that the Church's doctrines have changed. In seeking to propose that a hermeneutic of reform in continuity was essential to a proper understanding of the Council and the interpretation of both conciliar and post-conciliar developments, Pope Benedict confirmed the continuing centrality of the issue of development that John Courtney Murray had identified 40 years earlier. And it's an issue that has become entirely unavoidable now for theologians under the pontificate of Pope Francis, for reasons that I'll consider later. At the heart of the problem remains the fact that, just as it had been when Murray wrote 50 years ago now, the theology of development in Catholicism is still a relatively embryonic field. And it's reasonable to ask why that might be. Why would a church that's been around for 2 millennia only got around to considering how its doctrines developed within the last 200 years? One explanation for the undeveloped state of the theology of the development of doctrine is the phenomenon of magisterial positivism. That is, that proposed developments, innovations or novelties should be accepted simply because they're proposed by those holding teaching office in the Church. This achieved, for example, one expression in the traditional ultramontane form that reached its zenith between the two Vatican councils. It took another form in the conciliar positivism of the period immediately after the council, and has in the last 7 years attained to heights of which Blessed Pius IX, Henry Cardinal Manning and Wilfrid Ward could only have dreamed. That this latest manifestation has been advanced largely by those who spent much of the previous two pontificates denying or undermining the papal teaching office is an irony that should not be lost on us. Neither should the more outrageous absurdities that it's visited upon us. 2 + 2 = 5, anyone? Magisterial and specifically papal positivism has been so dominant in popular and scholarly Catholic theological discourse in the last 200 years that it's been possible to conduct that discourse in the academy, in ecclesial life, and in the increasingly important world of social media without being aware of the need to address the question of development except by reference to the argument from supposed authority. Often an authority of which the proposer of the development is not possessed, nor can legitimately invoke. A less than thorough commitment to the return to the sources, Scripture, the liturgy, the fathers, and the teachings of the other 20 ecumenical councils, have often seemed to be a justification enough for any passing theological and liturgical novelty, so long as somebody in authority proposes it. I mention the liturgy here, by the way, because I want to remind you that in its words and actions, in its text and its ritual, liturgy should be understood as theologia prima, the first theology. It's both a witness to and a vehicle for, in fact, the preeminent vehicle for the transmission of the tradition. In each of the forms that it's taken, this magisterial positivism manifests itself in a self-satisfied, self-referential justification for any particular claim by claiming for it the authority of a particular source, whether that source has either the office or the charism of proposing that change. And the fact that none of those forms of positivism have seemed to provide the necessary impetus for a widespread engagement with the task of working out actually what's happened, that is, one that takes both seriously the claims of continuity and change, is as much an indictment of the state of Catholic theology as are the attendant attempts to shore up arguably heterodox positions by proof texting sacred scripture, the Fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas, or even Newman himself, and doing so by quoting these authorities not just simply out of context, but plain contrary to their meaning, to the meaning of their authors. And there's a lot of that goes on. We'll see that with regard to Newman's notion of development a little bit later. Pope Benedict's insistence on a hermeneutic of reforming continuity suggests that, in his view, the question of what the theology of development should look like is something that we really can no longer defer. The apparent revisions to the Church's sacramental law, her theology of grace, and her view on the death penalty during the pontificate of Pope Francis, to which we might return later, have lent to this necessity a grave urgency, and one which cannot fail to be extremely uncomfortable for all of us. That Christian doctrine was static and immutable would have seemed to most self-evident for at least the first 1750 years of the life of the Church. To those schooled in a theology heavily reliant upon the categories of Aristotelian thought, at least in the expression St. Thomas Aquinas and others gave to it, the fixed nature of Christian doctrine was often seen as reflecting the unchanging nature of God himself and of the theology of the Incarnation as God's definitive, final self-communication to his creation. The German historiographer Ernst Breisach traces the remote origins of a beginning of an awareness of doctrinal development in the Catholic Church to the high medieval period, but as late as the 17th century, the bishop, historian and theologian Jacques Benin Bossuet could claim that variation in religion is always a sign of error, that the Christian religion came from its Lord complete and perfect, that the true Church had maintained immutably, must have maintained immutably, the deposit of truth which had been given to it. It was a view that is entirely coherent with that expressed by many in the 17th century. And 50 years earlier, the French Jesuit theologian Petavius described the history of dogma in his Opus De Doctrina Temporum, and in a vast and unfinished work, a bit like St. Thomas, the first systematic attempt to treat the development of doctrine, by saying that change in doctrine was simply not possible within the context of Christianity. Despite demonstrable doctrinal development, Petavius, like Bossuet, believed Christianity, as received from Christ, was whole and complete. What developed was merely the Church's ability or need to articulate what she'd received. Yet the very engagement spawned by Petavius and later by Bossuet, especially in the latter's history of the variations of Protestant churches, and in the correspondence it engendered between Bossuet and Leibniz, meant that Catholic theology couldn't remain indefinitely insulated against the currents of European thought that came to be called the Enlightenment. And certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, the development of doctrine had become an unavoidable question. By this stage, an awareness of the history of doctrine and the attendant notion of development was beginning to become more widespread. An example of this, for example, is found in the work of Johann Adam Möller and Johann Sebastian Drey at the Catholic faculty at the University of Tübingen. Their work was on occasion controversial enough to result in their being reported to the Holy See, but it was important enough to have placed the question of development at the centre of theological discourse at the beginning of the 19th century. Indeed, so central was that question to become that nearly 2 centuries later, Karl Rahner could write, as if it were a quite matter-of-fact observation, that, as Catholics, we believe in the development of dogma, that as the awareness of our faith becomes more and more developed, we achieve a deeper understanding of the dogma itself. Very, very different from Petavius's conception. Rahner treated the subject of development of doctrine in several essay-length pieces, and there's an undoubted awareness of development in the theology of other 20th century theologians, such as Congar, de Lubac, and Bernard Lonergan. Nevertheless, only one full-length treatment of the subject of the development of doctrine exists in what might reasonably be called Catholic theology, and that's the one given in John Henry Newman's An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, written whilst he was still formally an Anglican, but published immediately after his submission to the Church with no revisions. He offered to revise it, and Wiseman told him to publish it anyway. The singular status of this work is such that any attempt at understanding the development of doctrine and the attendant necessity of working out what practical form a hermeneutic of reforming continuity needs to take has to take account of the arguments that Newman proposes and the origins which underlie the structure of his proposition. The events leading up to Newman's production of An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine in 1845 are long and complex. They tell the story of one man's determination to offer a consistent and coherent account of the reality of religious experience, his own and others, of the dogmatic character of the Christian faith, and of the unavoidable fact that, at least in the form of its expression, Christian doctrine has developed over time. It was in part an attempt by Newman to resolve a personal ecclesial problem. Not whether he remain an Anglican, he'd already decided that wasn't possible, but whether he believed the claims that the Catholic Church made for herself, which was the test he always made for the convert. His correspondence in the 1860s is very touching. He keeps repeating this to people who saying to him, should I become a Catholic? Should I become a Catholic? And he says, there's only one question to answer. Do you believe that the Catholic Church is what she said she is? If you do, you must become a Catholic. If you don't, you can't become a Catholic. And it was the same question he himself had to address really from about 1838 onwards. But the essay also served the purpose of offering a cogent account of the development of doctrine in the history of the Church, a theology whereby, as he put it, in the face of a history, doctrine changes with changing historical exigencies in order to remain the same. We'll come across those form of words again later because they relate to the rather misquoted line about perfection and change. The shape of the essay on development reflects the fact that Newman had been grappling with the fact of development of doctrine for 20 years, substantially the whole of his adult life. He'd already proposed several hypotheses to account for it as an Anglican. The argument that the early church kept secret its doctrines for the fear of persecution and subsequently in freedom had been able to articulate them. He puts that forward in his first published book, an account of the Arian controversy. Second hypothesis he put forward was that the faith of early Christians was such that they knew the whole of Christian truth, but in an unexpressed, an implicit way, which needed to be expressed for and by later, less fervent generations. He has this kind of sense of sadness that as time goes on, we lose the power of the faith and therefore have to be rather more explicit in how it's expressed. He had a third hypothesis that development was little more than a matter of refining terminological precision in the face of logical inference. You start with something and you draw logical inferences from it, and what you have to do, therefore, is be quite precise about language. He suggested that that was perhaps a way in which the development of doctrine had occurred. And finally, he proposed the idea of Christian doctrine found in a via media, a middle way between extremes of doctrine and extreme forms of church government. As he looked at each of those hypotheses as an Anglican, each of them failed when tested against what we know of the history of the church's doctrine. They simply don't stand up to fact. And none of that need detain us further this evening, unless you're particularly interested in those Christological controversies of the first 4 centuries of the church's life. What we do need to think about is that for Newman, this was about identifying the identity of the church, not about writing either a systematic doctrinal treatise or working out something philosophically. And so the purpose of his Theology of the Development of Doctrine is to identify where the church is in order that he can ascribe to doctrines the character of corrupt or authentic. The thesis being, at least as he starts off, that the church can only teach authentically, and therefore, if you can find where the church is in any of these controversies, not so easy. If you can find where the church is in these controversies, then you can find the teaching of the church accurately expressed. Now, the argument that he put forward succeeded so far as his own personal position was concerned, as we well know, and it clearly enough satisfied him enough to facilitate or justify a conversion that cost him heavily, and for him never substantially to revisit the theological principles on which it rested. Although he wrote it in 1845, published it in 1845 in a second edition the following year, he reworked it substantially in the 1870s, but he didn't actually change the theology. He just made it read more fluently, and he changed some of the vocabulary in order to be slightly less strident than he felt he was able to be when he was 44. I think that happens to us all. There comes a time when you want to be slightly less strident. Yes, Sebastian, it'll happen to you too. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Whether and to what extent the theology in the essay on development is useful to our present position is a separate question to the question that Newman was asking, but it is one that needs to detain us for the rest of the evening. Newman's essay begins, rather like this evening's paper, with an extended introduction designed to explain Newman's purpose in writing it. He outlines the theological problem presented by the factual character of 3 things. Firstly, the idea of Christianity. Now, he rather inconveniently doesn't define what he means by the idea of Christianity. But it would appear that for him, the idea of Christianity is that very Augustinian conception of God becoming man for us and for our salvation in Jesus Christ. Augustine proposes that the test of orthodoxy is how a statement or a belief or a practice can stand up against the truth of Christus qui in carnem venisse, Christ who has come in the flesh. So we think that's a kind of working definition of the idea of Christianity for Newman. Secondly, his conviction that this idea is, and indeed must be, expressible in dogmatic form, in doctrine. Newman was explicitly dogmatic. He writes very soon after his first conversion at the age of 15. He confirms this in letters. He writes it in the Apologia. He writes it again in the 1870s, that the conversion that he experienced at the age of 15 was of an explicitly dogmatic character. He writes of impressions of dogma being made upon his intellect, which by the grace of God have never been effaced. And in fact, when he's made a cardinal, he gives a speech just before he receives the red hat, in which he says that the whole of his life for 30, 40, 50 years has been to fight against liberalism in religion. And he defines liberalism in religion as the anti-dogmatic principle. That is, that religious truths cannot be expressed in dogmatic form. Newman rejects that. So factually, Christianity exists as an idea. It's been long enough in the world, he says. Secondly, it can be expressed in dogmatic form, and thirdly, the fact that the historical record appears to demonstrate that that doctrinal form, that dogmatic form, changes. And this, he says, is problematic. And he offers the essay as an hypothesis to account for a difficulty. Now, there are those who would say that Newman comes up with the idea of writing this as a kind of justification for a decision that he's already made. I'm going to become a Catholic, and I've got to justify to all my friends who've been suggesting I've been a crypto-Catholic for years, I've got to justify to them that I'm doing this. But and many of those people said, well, you've just come up with this at the last minute. The truth of the matter is, he uses an expression preached in a little chapel in Southampton on Christmas Day in 1826, when he talks about the development of doctrine, and he talks about it requiring a hypothesis to account for the difficulty. This is something that has bugged him by 1845 for at least 20 years. He states quite clearly his methodological assumptions in that sentence that I cited in an abbreviated form a few moments ago, but to which we've got to return. It's there in the introduction, and it needs to be quoted in its entirety because, as will become obvious, the quotation is often ascribed to Newman as evidence that he believed that change was in itself a good thing, which was exactly what he wasn't saying. Here is, as the Americans say, the money quote. In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. It changes with them in order to remain the same. Close quotes. Newman believed that doctrinal change was necessary and only ever justified in order to preserve the truth of a faith once committed to the apostles. Development does not lie in some ongoing process of praxis or some dialectical process where we come the better to understand the data of revelation. Still less does he understand it as receiving a new revelation, new insights. But in order to ensure the transmission of doctrine whole and entire, doctrine has to develop in order to ensure its transmission whole and entire in both its original sense and character, because circumstances change. And he uses organic images for this. The idea, for example, that by some process of ongoing reflection within the church we might come today to see what was taught yesterday as being untrue, is simply not possible in Newman's conception. That isn't to say that prudential judgments of what may or may not be permissible at one time or another by those to whom it is given to make those judgments are one thing. Reversing truth claims are quite another, and no amount of tinkering with the text of the Catechism, no note from the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith referencing convinced Newman that it was even possible, let alone binding on the obedience of faith. This was the difference in Newman's own vocabulary between the authentic development of doctrine and corruption. Does it change in order to remain the same? If it changes to become something different, it's a corruption. If it changes in order to remain the same, it may be an authentic development. Having set up the status questionis in the essay, Newman proceeds to consider 7 different ways in which it's possible to demonstrate from history, and therefore to test, whether such and such a doctrinal development is authentic or corrupt. And we should look at these in brief at least. But before we do, we need to acknowledge 2 methodological considerations that arise from these 7. He called them tests in 1845, but by the time he was much older and reissued the essay along with all his other works in the 1870s, they were downgraded to notes, but they were substantially the same. Newman made his terminological change to make clear that he wasn't seeking to offer what Aidan Nichols calls a full criteriology of doctrinal development, but rather that he had a rather less ambitious objective. That was demonstrating that the doctrines particular to Catholicism, those that had developed since the patristic age, those that had developed after the doctrines settled upon by the whole of Christianity before the schism in the East and then later in the West were authentic developments. So he's concerned about things that arose after the first 7 councils, so after the Second Council of Constantinople, and 787 or something, and also with the developments that arose after the Reformation in Catholicism. He wants to be able to show that those are authentic developments of the faith that the Church held before that. The 7 notes exist then not to be used speculatively. They're not designed to be used prospectively. It's not as if Pier Paolo would come up with a suggestion. Let's teach this, and then you sit down with the 7 notes and say, does it meet this one? Does it meet that one? Does it meet that? That's not what they were designed to do. He doesn't propose them as a way for us to determine whether proposed development should be made. The teaching office of the Church, what he'd once called the prophetical office, doesn't work like that for Newman. The way the Church teaches is that she reflects upon old truths and proposes them anew in every time and every place as it responds to emerging circumstance, often heresies, and acts as a kind of breakwater. He uses the Latin word remora, a breakwater protecting the boats of truth within from the waves of change outside. So it's decidedly not a policy-making process, a world of bureaucratized doctrinal commissions. It's an apostolic office, and therefore a personal office, exercised by those whose task is to change things only in order that they may remain the same. Christ yesterday, Christ today, Christ tomorrow, the same. And the place of the laity in this process? Well, in his very much later on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, Newman again makes an important distinction. The question to be asked of the whole faithful and clergy is not, do you desire this change in the Church's doctrine? But rather, is this the faith of the Church? And here we might note that's precisely the question that Pius XII asked the bishops of the world to inquire of the faithful ahead of the definition of the dogma of the Assumption in 1950. It's not, can we make this change? It's, is this the faith of the Church? A faith that we receive. A faith that we receive with the responsibility to hand on entire. Not to change, to mould, to suit our own opinions and prejudices. So if these notes aren't prospective, how do we use them? Well, the short answer, as with most of Newman's theology, is patiently. Newman knew the history of the development of doctrine. His first published book, as I mentioned, was a history of the Arian crisis. He knew from the first formulation of that heresy, the belief that there was a time when the Son of God was not, that Christ, the Logos, was created. From the first formulation of that heresy by Arius in the early 4th century until the final and definitive condemnation of the consequential errors arising from it, took a century and a half, 4 ecumenical councils of the Church, a deal of civil and ecclesial strife, and more than little bloodshed. And still it persisted for another 250 years. We moderns are accustomed to a quick resolution of problems by means of clear, transparent processes. And it's undeniable that this brings many benefits in a number of spheres of life. But such processes are of necessity artificial constructs rather than the organic processes that Newman believes we have to apply. Newman did not expect that the Holy Ghost would lead us into all truth without us having to work out our salvation, and therefore the doctrines upon which he believed that depended, with fear and trembling, with patience and even with suffering. And all this is to say that we can only use Newman's notes in retrospect. We can only use them once a doctrinal change has somewhere been proposed by someone who has the office in the Church of reading the signs of the times and proposing such developments. And we can only use them in the context of the patient and respectful attitude required of those seeking to maintain and deepen true ecclesial communion. The second and shorter methodological point about the use of Newman's 7 notes of authentic development is that they don't work by majority vote. It isn't good enough to get 4 of his notes in favour and 3 against. Insofar as a note of authentic development can be found, for Newman it has to be positive. A single negative vote, that is, a vote that appears not to ascribe to a character, to a proposed doctrine, a character of authentic development, a single negative vote is enough to suggest that the development might be a corruption and that it requires further patient and respectful consideration of what's being proposed. In part, this is so because, as Aidan Nichols helpfully points out, the point of the notes, as I've already said, is not really to consider individual developments of doctrine at all, but rather for Newman to satisfy himself and his readers of objections to the claim of the identity of what he would once have called Romanism with the Catholic Church, with that established and endowed by Christ with the charism of indefectibility, and simultaneously acquitting it of a charge of believing in continuing revelation. We tend not to hear these things in these ecumenical days, but one of the great criticisms of Catholicism in the 18th, 19th and early 20th century was that it really believed in the future of doctrine rather than in the past of it. It's a criticism that a number of Victorian Anglican scholars made, that what the Catholic Church was looking to do at all times was to justify novelty. Newman wants to argue that this is just simply not true, and he wants to demonstrate, and I think he successfully demonstrates that. The 7 notes. If Newman were to be able to make a proper distinction, using his theory, between authentic developments and corruptions, then the cause of corruption in religion, as he put it, would need to be identified. And the first cause he identified, one which underlays several of his 7 notes or tests, and which he'd encountered during his reading of antiquity, and which he now saw exhibited in the search for primitive Christianity amongst Protestants, was a refusal to follow the course of doctrine as it moves on, and an obstinacy in the notions of the past. An illustration of this, having considered the evidence of Scripture, and in the particular case of the Sadducees. So after a short discussion regarding the literal meaning of the word corruption as used by material substances, Newman says that one of the problems with the Sadducees is that they wanted to remain faithful to a particular conception of doctrine which the rest of the people of Israel had moved on from. At least in the case of the people of Israel, as a result of the reception of further revelation, which of course he denies is possible to us after Christ. Any development, Newman argues, that allows us to draw a line between development and corruption is to be considered a corruption if it obscures or prejudices its essential idea, or disturbs the law of development which constitutes its organisation, or reverses the course of development. Whereas he continued, that is not a corruption which has both a chronic and an active state, chronic by which he means long term, and active state, or which is capable of holding together the component parts of the system. Newman understands doctrine as hanging together, not for some kind of abstract philosophical reason, but because it's about Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ is definite, is not an abstraction. I think that's another of probably then Cardinal Ratzinger's line about the importance of Mary in Christian dogma, because abstractions don't need mothers. So the result of this is a twofold test of unity in type, which allows Newman to set forth the 7 notes. And he admitted that those notes are, he says, of varying cogency and independence. So he's not suggesting that they operate like a tightly oiled machine. He admitted at the end of the first chapter that these criteria are of a practical character, and they're not determined on any logical principle of division. He's looked at history and drawn conclusions from them. He's not trying to read these notes back into history. He believes that they are self-evident, or at least demonstrable from the history of dogma. That is, from the history of the changes in the Church's expression of her doctrine. So those 7 notes are of almost secondary significance when compared with the answers to those questions of probability of development and the existence of an authority to judge. He believes it is probable that doctrine will develop because the world changes, and therefore what you and I see, the way you and I understand the world, is different from that of our forebears. And in order to remain faithful to the original idea, we have to find a way of expressing in a manner that is communicable and understandable to people in our age, or in the 17th century, or in the 7th century, or in the 28th century, those same truths. And that yesterday's answers may sometimes not be either communicable or convincing today. He uses at one point the analogy of a window, and he says that we paint a window, and we have to paint a window because if we don't paint a window, what actually happens to the window is it ceases to be a window, the glass falls out, it's just a hole in the wall, and that there is a difference between a hole in a wall and a window. It's not a very good analogy, but the point he's making is that we actually have to change things in order for them to remain in their original character. He does this particularly by looking at the development of the doctrine of who Christ is, and he tries to suggest, I think with some degree of accuracy, that far from being an innovation, Arius was actually he wasn't an innovator. Arius was trying to preserve a previous expression. He was trying to resist an expression of doctrine that said that Jesus Christ was God. There is an argument that says, of course, that when Arius first proposes that, before the Church definitively condemns it at the Council of Nicaea, before the Church condemns it, Arius isn't a heretic. He's simply using the form of the prior form of the Church's teaching. But the Church has come to understand that if you don't assert that Jesus Christ is true God, true God, light God from God, light from light, true God from true God, if you don't use that same language of Jesus Christ, what you actually do is you change the underlying meaning of the doctrine of the Incarnation. Now, it becomes very, very clear to the Church that the initial expression of that in the first symbol of Nicaea doesn't answer all the objections, and so the doctrine develops. It doesn't develop in order to change the truth of who Jesus Christ is. In fact, on the contrary, it changes in order to remain the same. That is, it changes in order to preserve the truth that the Church understands about who Jesus Christ is. What were those 7 notes? Firstly, a preservation of type or idea, that a development does not nor can represent the reversal of a prior doctrine, but rather it represents a development that is coherent and consistent with the prior doctrine. It goes in that direction. It doesn't change direction. At least it doesn't run back along itself. Secondly, continuity of principles. That is, that a change of doctrine must rely upon the application of principles already forming part of the Church's doctrine. It has to have the power of assimilation. That is, that it doesn't represent a dead end. That doctrine is always open to the assimilation of further ways of expressing the original truth. It has to manifest early anticipation. That is, that the doctrine should, at least in embryo, be foreshadowed in sacred scripture and in the apostolic era of the Church. It has to demonstrate logical sequence. That is, that it follows logically from prior doctrine. That it has preservative additions. That is, additions to it over time can be shown to preserve the prior doctrine and strengthen the prior doctrine. And finally, that it has what he calls chronic continuance or chronic vigour. That is, it lasts. It doesn't peter out. It seemed obvious to Newman that doctrines are developed by the operation of principles and develop differently according to those principles. If the principles alter, then the expression of the doctrine itself will alter, Newman argued. And those developments, if they really deserve the name, as he says, rather than being called corruptions, must be conducted all along on definite and continuous principles which determine their course. 20th century theologians who want to criticise Newman such as, for example, Owen Chadwick, the Anglican theologian, argued that Newman's tests were things that convinced no one and which Newman once himself admitted to be incapable of performing their ostensible purpose. Not entirely fair. He claimed that the momentous feature of the essay on development was that it was concerned less with the development of particular doctrines than with justifying Newman's conversion. Aidan Nichols, who we've seen takes a similar line, relies on Newman's remark that the tests are, quotes, insufficient for the guidance of individuals in the case of so large and complicated a problem as Christianity. But Newman wasn't suggesting that individuals were the judge of developments. For Newman, the judge of developments was the church, that is, the whole church, and the whole church over time. Nevertheless, Newman had his own reservations about the extent to which you could take a particular development and scientifically analyze the development, in part because he knew that we have very fragmentary records of what the church's doctrine was on a particular point at a particular time. Yes, I'm aware that the volumes of the Fathers take up 17 feet of bookshelf space in my sitting room, but they are what remains. And so, for example, when we talk about the Pelagian heresy, what do we know of Pelagius? Well, we know of Pelagius and his teachings by what his enemies wrote about him. I don't know about you, but my experience of human life is that people who are arguing against you rarely give a complete or convincing account of your own opinions. And that's certainly true. So Newman said, I lay down that no one can religiously speak of development without giving rules which keep it from extravagating endlessly. But these rules belong to the church and not to individuals. The introduction to the essay begins with the assertion that because Christianity is an historical fact, and its then 1800-year history of doctrine a matter of record, the very fact of that history requires a theory to account for the continuity of Christianity, given the claim that Christianity is not, in Newman's day, or now, a different religion from that of the apostles. What Newman had set out to prove was that in any century, what was believed by the Catholic Church can be seen to be the logical and necessary outgrowth and deeper understanding of what was believed in the century before, that there was both change and continuity, that these were not merely accidental to, but expected and intimately connected with the historical fact of doctrine. If examined in sequence, Newman would claim it was possible to see a natural progression, a true growth in doctrine. There was no observable reversal of course, but rather a continuation along a single track. An aspect of doctrine is clarified in one century, and in the next that clarification is investigated and built on so that further clarification is produced, often in response to heresy. And that which had been determined with finality in the past by the voice of the Church must later be kept. Old doctrines are not overthrown to make way for new ones. Instead, the Church's understanding of those older doctrines can be made more explicit, new aspects of the same truth can be added to it, and so by stages a fuller expression of the truth was possible, almost like looking at a three-dimensional object in two dimensions and then moving to a different perspective so that you can see perhaps the third dimension. In tracing this, Newman believed the question of the identity of the Church becomes apparent and indeed obvious. In the introduction to the essay, Newman outlined not only that this happens, but why it's important to understand the reason for and the process by which it happens. The difficulty is that Christianity has changed so much over the centuries that it's not obvious, at least not self-obvious, that there is a real continuity of doctrine since the apostolic era. And Newman noted the theory exists to help demonstrate that in fact, although it isn't obvious that there is that continuity, the continuity is in fact there. One thing was obvious to Newman, and that was what Chadwick rather superciliously calls, in one of Newman's typically loose use of words, that whatever historical Christianity was, it wasn't Protestantism. And Newman then says, if ever there were a safe truth, it's this. Newman believed that it was possible to prove that Christian doctrine did develop, that it was probable that the capability of development was a necessary part of doctrine, and he believed too there was an external authority capable of providing a warrant, authenticating those developments. He doesn't see that operating in a kind of juridical way, the idea of some kind of quick answer. He sees the church as reflecting upon developments and quietly discarding those that are in fact corruptions rather than authentic developments, except on very, very few occasions. And he notes, well, he's writing before the First and Second Vatican Councils, he notes that in 19 centuries there have been 19 councils of the church, and he seems to think that that's at least more than enough. It'll be obvious to you now that Newman was not automatically predisposed to accept a development of Christian doctrine as authentic without some investigation. I think I agree with him there. And like him, I hold to a very high theology of the infallibility of the teaching office of the church, to her indefectibility and to the particular expression of those charisms in the Petrine office. But like him too, I conceive of this as largely consisting in negative judgments by the church on doctrinal novelties. That's what Newman sees the church's teaching authorities saying. He looks at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and he says, what is it that Pope St. Leo the Great says? He says no. He doesn't say, here's a new idea. We've come to understand more about humanity. Here's a new idea. Leo the Great says no. And in confirming the teaching of the Council of Chalcedon, Leo gives an authentic expression of the Petrine office. We know the legend that once his letter was read out to the council, all 318 council fathers, curiously exactly the same number who were at Nicaea, all 318 council fathers cried out with one voice, Peter has spoken through Leo. I don't think we're obliged to believe that account. We should remember that the assistance of the Holy Ghost promised by the Lord to the apostles and their successors, to Peter and his successors, doesn't turn them together, or any one of them, into a further source of revelation. Bishops are not the authors of a third, newer testament. The Pope is not an oracle, even in the limited circumstances envisaged in Pastor Aeternus and reiterated in Lumen Gentium for the infallible exercise of his magisterium. Possessed of the sacramental charism that enables them to teach the faith with authority, possessed of the ecclesial charism that gives to the Pope full, immediate and plenary jurisdiction in sanctifying, governing and teaching the whole Church, the successors of the apostles, the successor of St. Peter, are entitled to an ascending order of respect and assent, depending on the character of the manner in which they've chosen to exercise that service. This inevitably means that there's always a presumption in favour of their teaching, at least unless the contrary can be immediately proved. The development of the Church's internal structures since the medieval period, in response to the serial heresies of conciliarism, Protestantism, liberalism and modernism, mean that we no longer have the means at our disposal to challenge official teaching immediately, and we lack a common language that means that the discourse is always in thrall to the translators. I saw today, for example, an article in which some of the language that's been used in the Instrumentum Laboris for the Synod on the Amazon points out that in the languages of Amazon, South America, the grammatical structure of the language means that words sometimes, which look like nouns in a European language, are in fact an entire construction of a sentence, including verbs, adverbs and adjectives. Now, I've some experience of this trying to talk to people, trying to teach people whose base languages are Sino-Tibetan languages, which have none of the shape, for example, of European languages, none of the grammar, none of the shape. It's very, very difficult to do that. The loss of a common language in theology is particularly problematic. And Newman wants to say that because of all these kinds of things, we actually have to take a long view. We have to take a patient view. We have to look at these developments and we have to say, And eventually the church as a whole comes to a settlement that says this corresponds to the historical idea of Christianity, that God has become man in Jesus Christ for us and for our salvation. The emergence since the Second Vatican Council of an official teaching, as distinct from what we might call the authentic magisterial teaching, is an unhappy consequence of a number of things. It's an unhappy consequence of the choice to hold an ecumenical council charged with being pastoral and not doctrinal at just the time when the Marxist twist on the Aristotelian notion of praxis was supreme. It's also not helpful that this has all been happening at a time when I can send Pier Paolo my address and he can print it off and make hundreds and hundreds of copies of it relatively cheaply. The reason for that is that technology, modern society as a whole, is impatient. And Newman wants to say that you cannot do theology, and you certainly cannot assess doctrinal development impatiently. Why? Because it's organic. Why? Because the church is not primarily juridic, it's primarily an organism. That is, the organism of the whole Christ, head and members united. And that we as members sometimes take quite a long time to catch up with the truth that the head once proclaimed. So the idea that doctrine might develop, and it might develop in some kind of simple, straightforward, easily judged way by virtue of pronouncements from ecclesial figures, has led to a kind of nightmare of development in the life of the church. And without a decent theology of development, without a theology of development that depends upon the character of nature, of revelation and upon the character of the church, life in the church becomes, as they said of England during the civil war between King Stephen and the Empress Maud, life as if God and his holy angels slept. Had Newman's theology of development of doctrine been better understood, perhaps, and more universally applied, were it now better understood and now better applied, it might now be easier to avoid the temptation to ascribe to every last, strictly speaking, non-magisterial, but official and therefore ubiquitous teaching of some of the developments of doctrine, the claims which get nailed to them. Writing to his brother Francis some 5 years before the essay appeared, Newman set out the principles for a theology of the development of doctrine, and I can scarcely end better than by quoting him. He writes, "All systems which have life have development, yet they do not cease to have an identity, though they develop. Development includes growth in the Church's ability to express its doctrines more accurately through time by the actions of its interaction with the historical and cultural phenomena that surrounds it. And there are tests by which these developments can be tested. Some of those developments will fail the test. Sometimes this far is too far." We might explore in some questions how that might work for us in 2019. Thank you.